Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. My name is Mysiak and I'm delighted to be the moderator. Today's speaker is Elisa Delpiazzo. She is a PhD from the Catholic University of Milan, specialized in quantitative method of economic policies. Previously, she got a master degree in economic politics and international institution from the University of Pavia. Elisa is working at Euro-Mediterranean Center of Climate Change, where she focuses on the evaluation of climate change impacts and evaluation of adaptation and mitigation policies. This webinar is dedicated to evaluating climate services in the cogeneration framework. It's a joint initiative of Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, CMCC, and the Climate Project. CMCC is Italian's largest institution dedicated entirely to climate change research, science and policy. It covers all the disciplines contributing somehow to analyzing the impact of climate change, from the climate modeling up to the economic impact. Climate Europe is a Horizon 2020 project set up to coordinate and support Europe's knowledge base to enable better management of climate-related risk and opportunities. It's a wide network for researchers, suppliers, and users of climate information, and is basically organizing exchange of best practices, analysis of gaps and recommendation, and a review of the state of the art. CLARA Project is a Horizon 2020 project. Elisa will talk about the yearly experience from CLARA Project. CLARA stands for Climate Forecast Enabled Knowledge Services. Horizon 2020 project set up to develop or further enhance 14 climate services from 5 priorities of global framework for climate services. You will find more information about CLARA at our webpage, clara/project.eu, or at Twitter, hashtag CLARAH2020. So without further, all right, there is one information about how to interact during and after Elisa's talk. You might post your question in opposite section of the GoToWebinar. You will find on the right side on the panel the dashboard where, or the place where you can post the chat, where you can post your question. Please do so as Elisa is speaking or right afterwards. The webinar will last for 30 minutes and then we will go through the question. Thank you very much again for joining, and Elisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jaro. With this presentation, we would like to explore the evaluation set for climate services in a cogeneration framework. Mainly, we focus on the role of the evaluation step, the actors involved, and the motivation. Why is so important? Then we focus to the CLARA project experience, with firstly an evaluation of the value chain analysis and some examples of methodologies, and 2 practical examples from Iriclim and Smart Hydro, 2 climate services developed by Ecosistema. And finally, we draw some conclusions. For people not involved in climate services, we give a first definition of what they are. They provide climate information and they assist decision making. A prerequisite for this is an appropriate engagement of the final users, as well as the requirement of the final users to be met. These data and information in climate services may include meteorological and non-meteorological data, as well as other socio-economic variables, according to the definition of the Global Framework for Climate Service. First of all, why is it so important to evaluate climate service? The value is the linking factor between service developers and final users. As you can see, on the left side, you can find the most important aspect that a developer may face when they want to evaluate giving a value to the product enhances the value itself, because you can find the bottlenecks and the problem inside your product. Then you can improve the service in the development phase, because the final aim of the developers is to raise the value to find the maximum value, so the value increases according to the development of the service itself. The value is also the basis for pricing and charging the climate service. And finally, demonstrating the value of the product justify the implementation or obtaining funding for further research. On the other side, final users instead, having the idea of the value, can foster awareness and strengthen the use of climate service, not only in private businesses, but also in organizing public policies based on this type of information. So, one of the most important aspects of value is defining the right metrics. So the unit of measure is fundamental, because on the basis of this measure, developers and final users can interact. But who are the actors involved? First of all, the evaluators. They are the people that find out the characteristic of the climate service and analyze the value chain in order to find the best methodology to draw this value. Secondly, the climate service developers. They have the idea of what the climate service is, so the main features of the climate services and how it works and the final outcomes. Finally, the final users. The final users has the role to contextualize the use of the climate service in the decision-making process, so they know how to use the climate service when the climate service is available. But according to these three actors, we can define some aspects that affect the value. And we find mainly four aspects. The first one, predictions, is strictly connected to the producer of the climate service. And we give some idea of what are these elements: accuracy, time and space scale, and credibility. They are all linked to how the climate service is developed. So what are the contents of the climate service? Instead, linked to the final user, we have the decision maker and the decision context spheres, both related to the final user. The former defines the characteristic of the decision maker, so the perception of the decision maker respect to the problem or to the aim of using the climate services, then the risk, so the attitude towards risk, and eventually previous knowledge that the decision maker use in its decision-making process. The decision context instead represents the sector. So according to the sector, we can have climate services involving agriculture decisions or decisions for energy production and so on, and the scale of application, because the climate service could be used from an individual, a single farm or firm, but also from the entire society. Finally, the society-science interface. This is not strictly related to developers or final user, but it mostly considers the interaction of the climate service with the whole context. And the most important aspects are trust, because the scientific information should be consistent and should be organized in a trustful way. Dissemination, so how we disseminate the information, and the cogeneration. So cogeneration is something that involves a feedback loop between developers and final users. Each one is fundamental and gives some value added in the generation of the final climate service. Well, according to these four spheres, and we can find the six main methodologies. according to literature: decision theory-based models, comfortable general and partial equilibrium models, contingent valuation, benefit transfer, econometric models, and qualitative studies or ex post analysis. These 6 methodologies differ in terms of these 4 aspects because according to predictions, for instance, we have that decision theory-based model gives very important emphasis on the features of the climate services. For example, the accuracy of the information, of the prediction, or as qualitative studies or ex post analysis gives importance to some feature such as usability. But all the other methodologies disregard the aspects of the characteristics of the climate services. They may be inserted, as in terms of the partial equilibrium model or computable general equilibrium model, but they are not fundamental. The decision maker is instead fundamental for decision theory-based model because the decision space, so which actions are available after the climate service information are known, is a fundamental element to set up these models. There is a low involvement of final users for contingent valuation. This is a practical involvement mainly because the final users has to answer questionnaires. So they have quite a limit engagement. Then the decision context is defined exactly as when the decision maker is so important. So in decision theory-based models, in contingent valuation and qualitative studies. The society-science interface is something that instead is less considered in these methodologies, is partially considered for ex post analysis, for instance, related to communication, but it becomes crucial for benefit transfer because benefit transfer needs comparability, and the comparability is mainly reached in terms of science and society interface. A different type of science-society interface can be found in the partial equilibrium and general equilibrium approaches, because in this case, the interaction is more in the sense economic and science interface, because we can capture interactions with economic space, for instance, to prices. Well, to start with the CLARA project, we define the value chain for each service, distinguishing at which level of this production chain the value added is created. We have different steps, and we find 3 critical points. The first one is in forecasting, the second one in dissemination and communication. But for most of the services of the CLARA project, we find that value added is created in the last step, when information is used and decisions are taken. These are the services that enters the different steps. So we have in horizontal services, the post-processing decadal prediction that gives value added in the forecasting step. Then another service, the air cloud service, that receive the value added in the dissemination and communication, but all the other CLARA services have a value added when they are employed in the decision making. The first example is eRecline, a service developed by Ecosistema, and as I told you before, its value added is given in the decision-making step. According to the previous theoretical background, in the predictions, the characteristic of the service is the time span. It has 3 time span, 2020, 50, and 80. So from short to long run. The space, that is an irrigation district. This service is based on climate projections. And the final data, the final outcome of the service, comes from an ensemble of models with different RCP, GCM, and also different hydrological models. What we suppose on the decision maker? Well, the decision maker is risk neutral, and he has a knowledge on actual climate. The decision context identify as a sector of application agriculture with a crop-specific focus. Then the scale is the irrigation district, so not the farm level as it seems at a first sight. And the idea, the decision to take is to plan irrigation investment. The society-science interface is based on cogeneration. Well, we value the economic value of this service using the value of information theory, that is one of the different types of decision-based models. What we assume, first of all, an assumption taken from Murphy 1994, that the information has no value per se. So the information has a value only if it allows the final user to change his action. Second, the service is based on climate projections, so we assume perfect information. There is no possibility to define the accuracy of the service when it is based on climate projections. And thirdly, because of perfect information, what at the end we have is the maximum economic value of the climate services. To define exactly the exercise, we need 4 types of information. Firstly, the aim. So, which is the final aim of using the climate services? This irrigation district, that is the district of Castiglione, wants to plan for irrigation investment with different time horizons to avoid a technological water deficit in the future decades. We know that we have climate change impacts, so a reduction of available water, but we want to find the best irrigation system to cope with it. The decision space provides 3 alternative irrigation systems. Firstly, the actual one, so sprinkler irrigation, then drip irrigation and sub-irrigation. Each of them has different installation costs and ability to cope with climate change impact. We assume that climate change impact means a 25% reduction in water availability. Then, District of Castiglione has 2 possible informative sets to use. It can decide to use current climate information and suppose that no changes happen in the future. Or secondly, it can base its decision-making on irricline, considering 3 different RCPs, 3 hydrological models, and up to 4 GCM. Finally, the payoff, so when the decision is taken, what are the benefits or losses? They are composed of the cost of installation, because it is specific of the irrigation technique, and a crop yield loss. The crop yield loss comes when the technique is not able to cope with climate change. So when we are not able to avoid the physical water deficit. Given the mean root length of the crops and the land characteristic, we know that the yield loss is 30% of 2016 production. In this case study, we focus on 5 main crops: horticultural crops, actinidia, persimmon, peaches, and seed chard, that together count for nearly 95% of the total crop production in Castiglione district. These are some results. Above, you have a table. It considers the optimal irrigation technique according to crops in the different RCPs. Taken, for example, horticultural crop. Considering actual climate condition, the best technique is drip irrigation. But Supposing that in the next decades, the climate will change according to RCP 8.5, the best irrigation system is a sub-irrigation. It is more costly, but it gives you the possibility to avoid the loss in water availability. On the other hand, if RCP 4.5 is the future climate, you can continue with your irrigation system in 2020, but then in 2050 and 80, so in a longer perspective, you have to change your system. Differently for kiwi or actinidia, the business as usual technique is less useful both in RCP 8.5 and 4.5, because in both cases, sub-irrigation is the best choice. So, coming directly from this table, on the left side, you have the value of the service per crop, RCP, and here. You can find that, for instance, in RCP 8.5, the value of the service increases from 2020 to 2080. And especially in 2080, the most important aspect is the increasing of value for persimmon and peaches, while they are completely not considered in 2020. Why this? Because in 2020, RCP 8.5, as you can see from the table, the business as usual irrigation technique is enough to cope with climate change. In the right-hand side, instead, you can find the value according to RCP and the crop composition. So the value goes from nearly 6,000 euro per hectare to 900 euro per hectare. The highest in RCP 8.5 because you have the highest impact on crop yield, and you have to choose a different irrigation technique for most of the crops, while for RCP 2.6 you have a lower level. There is also a different change in crop composition. So, for instance, persimmon is a really important crop in defining the value of irricline in RCP 8.5, while instead seed chard becomes the most important one for RCP 2.6. The second example is smart hydro. The time frame for this analysis is 2011-2014, and the analysis of this case study is located in two reservoirs in Colombia, Betania and Guapio. The service is based on seasonal forecasts. So in this case, an important feature of the service is the accuracy. And another important aspect is that this is a retrospective analysis. From literature, we know that one of the most important bottlenecks in evaluating climate services is the lack of data. So how we can do with lack of data. In this case, because the service is at the pilot level, we had a very similar problem. So we decide for a retrospective analysis. The decision maker instead is Enel Green Power company. It is a risk-neutral, we suppose a risk-neutral decision maker, and it has knowledge on climate in the period 2001-2010 in this reservoir. The climate service is used to decide on the production of hydropower, and again, this service is co-generated. Even in this case, we want to use the value of information theory, but in this case, the service is based on seasonal forecast, so we assume that we have imperfect information. A retrospective analysis means that at the end, what we have is the maximum value of the climate service in our reference period, supposing that the climate service has a 100% accuracy rate. To set up the framework of the analysis, Enel Green Power wants to use the climate service to forecast the water volume in the reservoir, because water inflows affect the total hydroelectric production. And also Enel is supposed to use the same operational rules that it currently adopts. Enel has two possible information to use. One is mean monthly forecasts for the periods 2001-2010, and the other one is the optimal smart hydro service that replicates exactly what happened in the period 2011-2014. The decision space is what have been the gains of the producer in that period using the new information. In this case, the decision of a payoff is more difficult. It is probably hard to find the monetary payoff. This is a work in progress in the CLARA project, because it is composed of several components, and many of these may be also sensitive information for the company. So, for this first step, we use an expert-based score system ranging from 0 to 10. So we ask the expert, so to the final user, to give a score, and the score is based on the ability to predict correctly. So if the service correctly predicts the amount of water inflows or not. The prediction itself, because if I correctly forecast the water inflows, I can forecast to be in a normal useful range, above or below, and other key elements such as the production level itself, but also transaction costs when the predictions are wrong. Because we have no data on future prediction of the service, as I told you, it is at the pilot level, we consider the retrospective analysis. Firstly, the ideal smart hydro gives the maximum expected value because it replicates exactly the historically trend in the reference period. Then we have the expected value using the previous knowledge. In this case, the accuracy is lower than smart hydro. So the difference between the two is the maximum expected value of the service in the reference period. There are at least three elements that influence this analysis. First of all, the reference period for the previous knowledge. We have the period 2001-2010. It's 10 years. If you extend this period, probably you will have higher variability in data, so you can have a lower accuracy. This means that probably the ideal smart hydro have a higher value, total value. So firstly, the reference period for the previous knowledge is particularly important. But the historical value are also strictly related to the reservoir. In this case, Betania and Guavio are two different reservoirs with different sizes and different characteristics. That's why, for instance, for the Betania reservoir, the expected value of the information is 3.86, while for Guavio it is only 1.84. This is because Betania reservoir is less prone to variability than Guavio. Then another thing that can affect the analysis is the choice of the reference period. So we suppose a reference period of 5 years, but if we consider a different time span or other five years, we can have different values. But this is exactly what we want to use to demonstrate that the evaluation is fundamental for cogeneration. This is important for the specific final user, and this gives a measure for this specific final user. The methodology could be reused in other cases, assuming different location, assuming different time period, assuming different final user, and you can have a sort of mapping of the evaluation differentiated across geographical scale or across different users. In conclusion, we demonstrate that the evaluation is an essential phase in the cogeneration process. It is not a step per se. It enters in the cogeneration and co-development phases as well. So it can strengthen and reinforce the feedback loop inside the generation of the climate service. It is useful to find a methodology that can incorporate the 4 aspects we highlight, because the 4 aspects represent exactly the role and the participation of the different actors in the cogeneration process. The examples shows a likely methodology to exploit the potential role of climate services, the potential benefits of climate services in the cogeneration process, and it provides some practical tips to overcome specific problems. As I told you, in the case of Climb, we had a climate projection-based service, so we had to change the methodology, to adapt the methodology to consider this aspect. In the second case, instead, we have seasonal forecasts, so we adapt the methodology to consider for accuracy. We have to overcome data limitation in the case of smart hydro, because we do not have a final product, but only a pilot. So this gives you the idea of how to work with the methodology and adapt it to the specific case. One important thing to note is that these are first preliminary analyses inside the CLARA project. So we are working to find other methodology to evaluate the services whose value added is generated in different phases. So what I highlight you for this, in this specific case, probably we have to change or adapt this methodology or eventually find something different. So the presentation is okay. And that's all. Thank you for joining this webinar.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Axon, we have already some questions, but before I pass them to Elisa, I'd like to encourage you, please post your questions on the chat area that you see on the right side panel. You simply click and write down your question. If possible, please include also your affiliation, so we have complete information. So we have already received 5 or 6 questions. So jumping, directly to the question of Roger Street. Thank you, Roger. And I combine that also with a question from Alberto Troccoli. Thank you, Alberto, again. So both questions are similar. Roger is asking, how is perfect information defined? You mentioned, in perfect case, we would have this information and we can assess the services. So Roger says, from the decision perspective, for example, relevant, usable, credible, and legitimate information is taken into account, or is it from the supply side, for example, accuracy of that information? And I just add to this the question from Alberto, who is asking, what is meant by imperfect information, and what do you mean by 100% accuracy on the small hydro case? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jaro. First of all, perfect information is considered at the supply side. This means that when we base the service on climate projections, there is no way to have the idea of the accuracy of the service, so of the projections. So we have to consider that if you project something in RCP 8.5, it is true and it will happen in the future. On the other side, instead, imperfect information is something strictly related to seasonal forecasts. So this means that when your climate service predicts something, you have the possibility to have a measure of the accuracy, mainly based on a test period in the past. So you can see how much is able your service to predict correctly. For instance, in the case of smart hydro, the idea was the final user identify 3 different levels in the reservoir in terms of water inflows. One that is a normal range, one is above, and one is below. Your service can predict to be in the normal range, and at the end you find that you are exactly in the normal range, but you could be also below this normal range. So there is the accuracy in this term, and the accuracy enters the imperfect information assumption.
Thank you very much. Alberto refined his question, but I think you have already answered a big part of his second question. Could you please expand on how the expected value of imperfect information on the smart hydro case was actually calculated? And also, how long did the case study take to execute? So
Okay.
how much time did it require for you to estimate the value?
Okay, from a practical point of view, the estimation is really straightforward. You need the help of the final user and the help of the service developer, because our information comes from them. So for us, the evaluation is quite straightforward, because if you know the main methodology, you can adapt and change it quite in few days, we can say. But at the same time, you ask the information, such as the payoff or the probabilities associated with the different state of the world, and these are information that are not for the evaluators. So they come from the final user, who better knows how the information are used in the decision-making process, or from the development side, from a service producer that knows the outcome of the service.
Thank you, Elisa. There's another question of Roger, which is related to what you just said. He's asking, are there means of capturing value through engagement of users in different elements of the value chain? It has often been stated that there is a value for climate services as a result of sustained and therefore informed engagement. So his question is, to what extent the user engagement co-generates the value or influences the economic assessment, or really give the legitimacy to the value assessment?
Okay, the engagement of the final user in the evaluation step is fundamental. It is fundamental because firstly, the engagement of the final users is reinforced in this step. So the evaluation is useful for the final user because it has an idea of the value. It is also a stimulus to understand if the user requirements are correct, if they go in the right direction, or if they are not adequate to describe or to give information useful in the decision-making process. On the other side, the engagement of the developer is as important as the one of the final user, because it gives the value gives the stimulus and the idea of how much the service is good in its development phase. So the engagement is fundamental in defining the value, not only in the practical phase to find out the data to provide to the evaluators, but also in the relation between the final user and the developer.
Thank you, Elisa. We have a couple of questions or remark from Rob Swart. Thank you, Rob, for that. So his first remark is, On the slide 7, in your presentation, you quoted Marta Bruno Soares, and translated into your framework climate prediction, leaving out projections, but more importantly, also ignoring socio-economic vulnerability and risk reduction options, thus limiting the scope of impact from climate services from the start. I think this is your presentation highlighted the different type of climate services, not only linked to the prediction or forecast, also projections. But this is our first comment. Rob, would you like to reflect on that?
No, I think it's a very good a very good point. Yeah, this is an extension we have to consider. Absolutely. Thank you for the feedback.
Excellent. And then Rob continues with another question, and he says, the examples that you showed reflected research. Would this kind of work in the future be more the responsibility of public research organization or private sector consultants? So could you, basically the question, as I read it, might be, can you turn the assessment of the value of climate services into a service itself?
Yeah, it could be. It could be a sort of service itself, yeah. It could be, I think it is not just research. It has an academic interest, absolutely, but I think that the evaluation of climate service is really important in the private business sector. So I think that it could become a service itself, yes.
Thank you for that. And we have another comment, a question from Adrian Perels from Finnish Meteorological Institute. He is writing, very well organized and clear presentation, thank you. Are you planning to assess effects of availability of specific climate services result for user from the same sector, for example, computing fruit growers and consequent macroeconomic level effects? So is your work focusing on specific sectors, or is it more horizontal, trying to find best practice example for evaluating services in different domains?
Okay, thank you for the question. The first idea is to evaluate the CLARA climate services. They are different services with different domain, and we want firstly to evaluate them mainly at the individual firm scale. But it is really an interesting aspect to include also the macroeconomic evaluation, and eventually, according to data availability, it could be interesting also accounting for non-tangible benefits, such as environmental benefits of climate services use in different sectors.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Diana Morales from Deltares. Within the 4 aspects evaluated, you have the decision makers and the risk is being evaluated. In both examples, the decision maker was stated as neutral. Why? The risk is evaluated with respect to what?
Okay.
So that's basically the risk attitude of your policy or user perspective. So how do you model the risk attitude, and why would you give the preference to the risk neutral attitude rather than risk seeking or something else?
We have to re-stress that these are first insights from the project. So we start with risk neutral decision makers. We would like to expand the analysis considering different risk attitudes. This means increasing the complexity of the whole evaluation framework, but it is something that we are working on.
Excellent. We have another question from Adrian, and his question is, the generation of social value added in principle does not guarantee that the service can be gainfully provided or exploited. Are you planning to assess how value added can be captured in a way that enables viable business model?
Okay, that's another point. We know that the business model for climate service is based on the value we calculate, we can see, and that there are different barriers in the market. This is out of the scope of our analysis in the CLARA project. There is another work package working on this, but yeah, you are right. When we calculate the value, we are not sure that at the end, although there is a positive value for the climate service, it will be used in practical terms.
Yeah, Adrian added to his question, the point is that the profit of the climate service use depends also what the competitors do, right? With the information, right? Excellent, thank you very much. Then we have next question from Grit Martinez from Ecologic, and the question reads, which methods do you use to analyze the subjective perspectives and the attitude of policymakers? Thank you very much. So again, the sort of attitudes and the subjective perception. Do you have any suggestion how to take them into account?
Okay, the main important aspect to consider subjective perception is through the risk attitude. So this is the most important aspect to consider when we want to define and diversify the decision makers. So that's the main point.
Excellent. Then we have one remark from Francesco Bosello from CMCC, our colleague, and he's saying there is an important issue to consider. To elicit the value of a service, the help of the user of that service is often crucial. But the user is also the one who then has eventually to pay for the service. Sooner or later, some conflicts could appear and some different methodologies or user engagement have to be found for that case. Would you like to reflect on what Francesco is saying?
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is, for instance, one of the main problems in contingent valuation as the mean to evaluate a climate service, because the final user can decide to elicit a willingness to pay that is lower than what it really could pay, because it says, well, after I evaluate, I give a value, then they will ask to price or charge the service at this level. So I would like to give a lower price. So that's true. That's a crucial point. It's also a crucial point, the fact that most of the information we need can be sensitive for private companies, or the perception of the unusefulness of the climate services when they are related to public authorities in most cases, because they say, well, we can give a value to the service, but at the end we have no way to price it because we are a public authority. So we have no possibility to make a real business model for the service or to gain profits. Instead, also in this case, the evaluation of the climate service has an important role.
Excellent. Now we have a very tough question from Alberto again, Alberto Troccoli, and he is asking, this is a tough question, he says, would you have an estimate on how many types of value assessment would be required to provide confidence to the market on the use of climate information? So how many exercises we would need to repeat in order to raise the confidence of the market or the market investors in making important choice with respect to. And he's adding one more comment. Could you comment on both the case of seasonal forecast and climate projection with respect to this question?
I don't know exactly how many, but I can say that in the cases we reported in the examples inside the CLARA projects, the request for the evaluation of the service comes directly from the final users, especially when the final user is a private company. They directly ask the evaluation, and the trustful evaluation is partially something related to the evaluator, but partially it is something related to the engagement of the final user with the developer in the co-generation and the co-development phases. So I don't know exactly how many they should be, but I know that this is the right way to raise the level in the engagement and the adoption of the climate service.
And I fully agree with that. This is absolutely critical to estimate the value and raise the confidence in the value estimation in order to promote the use of climate services in practice. I have one more question from Mattia Leone from Naples University, who is also contributing to the project Clarity, which is the twin project of CLARA. So Mattia is writing, does CLARA project or the climate services being developed a specific input requirement from end users, for example, crop types in the area, in order to estimate the value? If so, are those results handled through an automatic web-based system or exchange offline between end user and the CLARA experts? So basically, this question is asking how we engage the end user in getting the information that we need for assessing the value.
Okay, the evaluators have no direct relation to with the final users. So that's the first point. The relation is shared with the developers, who knows their final users, who has a relation with them. So firstly, this is the point. We disseminate and we discuss the methodology with the developers, and we present a sort of example of the whole methodology to the developers, and then they ask for the final user and discuss with them to find out the data. And that's another crucial and important point. They have this relation, this special relation. Developers and final users start in discussing and defining the characteristics of the climate service. So we find that this special relation should continue also in the evaluation step.
Thank you very much. As we are slowly running out of the time, I have one last comment of Roger on which you might comment afterwards. And then I would simply, suggest we stop here, but we preserve all your questions and we will pass all your comments and questions to Elisa. And then Elisa, if you could, show again your email, so everybody can contact you with additional question or comment. So here comes the last Roger comments, and this is the point estimating the value of climate service is particularly critical in the case of public climate services. The value of the climate service might be particularly high, but providing it is seen as a public good and therefore should or must be provided through public funds. So this is a basic comment, right? So whenever we provide public services for free, right, as a public good, they should be accompanied by the economic value they provide to the different operators. But wouldn't that apply also for some commercial services?
Yeah, I think that there is no fundamental difference between private and public climate services. The only thing is the role of the final number you find. Because for the private sector, it could be, well, the value is this, so you can price and you can sell, you can decide your business model based on this. On the other side, having the number means simply, well, you have one more reason to introduce climate service into public policies. I know that you can't pay, so the business model is not simple to do, but this is another stimulus to introduce climate service in the policy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elisa. Could you please show your email address that everybody can note that? So thank you, Elisa. Thank you also to all of you who attended this webinar. The webinar has been recorded and will be available from CMCC YouTube channel. The slides will be available in PDF format to all of you. And we will definitely organize another webinar dedicated to assessing the economic value of climate services later on, right? Perhaps next year, once we have done the assessment for all the services or most of them. So there might be a very interesting follow-up. In the meantime, I'd like to invite you for the next CMCC webinar, which will take place next week on Tuesday, 31st of July, and we will focus on managing data in a large-scale climate modeling project given by Valentin Anatraya. Thank you very much again. So as I said before, we will pass all your questions to Elisa, and she might get back to you with additional response. If you have any question on organization of this, on the team that is organizing the webinar, please send an email to webinar@cmcc.it. And unless, Elisa, you want to say some, few thoughts, concluding remarks, feel free to do that.
To thank everybody attending the webinar, and I would like to have your comments and feedback to improve our work in the CLARA project evaluation. So thank you.
Thank you very much again. So thank you, and I wish you a nice day. Bye-bye.